Hello. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jon Ingham. I'm a former international HR director, an HR consultant, a trainer focused around strategic and people-centric HR, mainly through a digital platform, the Strategic HR Academy, where I run courses and study groups in different topics, including innovated modern performance management. It's a topic I'm really interested in, and was delighted to be invited to talk to this group and one of its first calls, setting up this project focusing on making businesses flourish through performance management. Most of the content I'll take you through is from the course in the Strategic HR Academy, where I take HR practitioners through all of the changes, the case studies which have been going on to transform performance management and do it in a fundamentally better way, with better impacts. And also offer a couple of my own solutions that can sort of extend the opportunity for performance management even further. And in this session, I'm going to share with some of the case studies, some of the examples, some of the changes with you, and also two, and there are others, but share two of the sort of key, what I'd suggest the opportunities to improve and transform performance management as well. So the first thing I just wanted to start with is just the amount of change that there has already been. And I'm focusing on this partly because I think it's important, in a project focused on innovating performance management. I think it's important that everybody understands what's already been done, so you don't reinvent the wheel. And I suppose just from a personal perspective, Otti in particular has been doing some great posts on LinkedIn about performance management. I think some of the comments perhaps have been slightly uninformed, maybe unhelpful even, particularly in terms of blaming HR for not doing anything, because we are, we've done a lot. And actually a lot of the issues around performance management, they're not HR and they're not performance management. They're bigger things. So, the nature of the organization, as an example, most organizations today are still traditional functional hierarchies. We have a manager and they cascade their objectives to the team below them. And if that's what you've got, then, that manager's always going to be interested in reviewing the objectives and the performance of the people working for them. How could that be different? So I think there's a lot, but there is a limit to how much you can change performance management without changing the nature of the organisation. And there's a lot happening. So the previous call, we had somebody who's involved in self-management. Michele Zanini was talking about humanocracy and sort of team-based autonomous organizations. Any change like that starts to make it easier to do performance management differently as well. There's the whole system and culture around performance management as well. In fact, probably the first book that focused on transformed performance management by Tom Cohens and Mary Jenkins, that made the point that it's not the process, it's everything else around the process, which HR can influence, but really is sort of down to business leaders to make work. Similarly, Michele's Mix group that does hackathons on different topics, their hackathon on performance management, most of the conclusions of that were actually, if not all the conclusions, were about the culture and nature of the organisation. They weren't actually on performance management. Otti has been posting a lot recently about political ideology and how that impacts performance management, and I completely agree. Otti, it's the point I made when we spoke about this originally, that there is no one single performance management. There's lots of different approaches depending on what you're trying to do. And if your business leader's ideology is to treat people in a manipulative, instrumental type of way, performance management is a tool. The tool works, actually. That's part of the problem. The performance management will enable you to be manipulative. That's not performance management's fault. That's the ideology of your business leaders. And look, I completely agree, Otti and everybody. The HR has got a role to play in pushing back against that, but it's not HR's problem. And the other thing that is often mentioned at this point the skills of business leaders and line managers. I have to say, personally, I'm not totally convinced by that. I think I don't think performance management is a terribly difficult thing to do, and I suspect a lot of the reticence or poor performance in managing people's performance is that we've put something clunky in front of people that they don't like and don't want to use it. It's not necessarily their skill. It's that we've not transformed performance management sufficiently. Look, I work independently. I manage my own business. The academy, the academy is a bit of a family endeavour, but basically it is just me. I manage my performance every day. There's no day that goes past that I'm not thinking about my performance and asking people for a little bit of feedback. So it's just a very natural, intuitive sort of thing to do, and that's where we need to go with performance management. Again, Otti, one of your posts I think was about making performance management not quite suck so much. Really, I think we can do better than that. Performance management should be, something which is just integral to performance. Why wouldn't you manage how can you perform without how can you work in an organization of any description and not think about managing your performance? It shouldn't suck at all. It should be something that enables you to do what you want to do, that is just a natural part of what we do. Anyway, so just wanted to make those points, but I have promised you more specific changes, suggestions of things you might want to do to make performance management suck a little bit less, or to be a really transformative basis of your organisation and personal success. And the first thing I just wanted to focus on is the first part of this. There's been lots of change. So this was a graph developed 10 years into this sort of major uptake of organisations transforming performance management. Not tinkering with the rating scales, but doing something fundamentally like dropping ratings or whatever it may be. So within that first 10 years, 400 or more organisations doing something very different. The slide was from the Neuro Leadership Institute because they were promoting these sort of changes, because things like the threat state is a big barrier to effective performance management. So anything that can get away from that, and I'll be talking about some of the things that you can do to get away from it, is seen here as very positive. So this curve has obviously continued for a long time post 2017. It has plateaued because nothing can carry on growing that steeply forever. And there has been some sort of moving backwards as well. A couple of the case studies, Gap, who are one of the earlier organisations to change, they've undone some of the things they did. Antoinette was talking in the first call, suggesting that SAP have put forced rankings back into the business. I hadn't heard, but there are examples like that. I do think we need to be a little bit cautious about some of these examples. Microsoft, for example, came up for a lot of criticism a couple of months ago with people suggesting it had unpicked its transformed performance management approach. I don't think it has. Most of the criticism was because it was differentiating pay. And, I'm sorry, but that's sort of something that most organisations are going to want to continue doing. But as far as I know, they're still not using ratings or forced rankings in order to do that differentiation. Performance management is still very much a focus on helping people grow and develop and get better. But in the reward process, the managers talk about what they're going to pay people. I just don't see the issue in that, really. Anyway, there's been lots of change, lots of organisations changing. So that was this slide. And then the next is a quick summary of some of the most prevalent, some of the most important changes. And I'm just going to talk these through with you really quickly. Because there's a lot to get through, and there were more I'm not even going to attempt to get into. But my sort of high-level categorisation for now, at least, are these four big buckets. So firstly, more agile, small a agile, just more flexible, more faster, and so on. Continuous performance management, probably the big change. Most organisations, there are some organisations that still do once a year appraisal and that sort of it. Not many, actually. Performance management has morphed into something which is a lot more continuous. Use of OKRs rather than smart objectives, ongoing real-time feedback. And in some agile, big A agile organisations, performance management is truly agile. So it's been integrated into retrospectives and so on. So, I do think there's been a lot of change in that space. Performance management is much more agile than it used to be, and perhaps sucks a little bit less as well, therefore. Secondly, performance management, I think, is more human. Probably not enough still, but, it has improved. It's much more about the individual than just about the business. It's still about the business because, it's performance management and that's sort of quite important, but it's sort of covering both polarities much more than it used to do. So less top-down cascade, where the chief executive sets their objectives and then 6 months later everybody has their objectives, and that was always nonsense. And to some extent it still happens, but most people now have some opportunity to set their own objectives. What's most important to them at the point in the performance, at the point in the organisation, where they focus. More use of behaviours, developmental objectives, more individual ownership for performance management. Kelly Services, one of the first organisations on that slide I showed you, their whole transformation was about taking the responsibility for performance management from the manager to the employee and telling the employee, look, you book the appraisal, you tell the manager to come along. You tell the manager what would be helpful. And because the employee now owns the process, they put more into it and ensure they get more out of it. Obvious. A lot of focus at the moment on employee experience, as you'd expect, probably. And I do think this is one of those areas which it hasn't really cut through as yet. Because what I see a lot of organisations doing, and this applies to employee experience more broadly actually, is taking clunky processes and sort of dressing them up so employees don't perceive them as being so clunky. But you still got a clunky process. Personally, and I write a lot about this on LinkedIn, I've got a newsletter on multi-sided HR, this idea that HR should help the business achieve its objectives, but we need to help employees as customers achieve what they want from their employment as well. That's where I think we need to go with the experience of performance management. And actually we did this at Ernst & Young when I was a HR director in the 1990s. We developed performance management into a two-way management of the employment deal. So the organisation managers reviewed employees on their performance against their objectives, but we asked them to tell us how well we had engaged them based upon how they had told us at the beginning of the year they wanted to be engaged. So it was a much more two-way thing. And because there was a benefit for the employees as well, again, we got more ownership and involvement and engagement from them in performance management. Dropping ratings and rankings. And again, there's been some pushback against that more recently. But you know, they have reduced in the numbers of organisations they're used in. Although you know there are still other tools like 9-box grids, which still as prevalent as ever. Which doesn't make sense, does it? I mean, if you think ratings are a bad idea, why give people double ratings? No. Anyway. And on that, less bureaucracy, more emergence. We can still do better, but you know, we are getting away from so much bureaucracy. Adobe, again, one of the earlier organisations change, their whole transformation was about dropping the process, not dropping the management of performance. You know, they still believe very strongly in managing performance, but getting rid of performance management because it seemed to get in the way rather than help managing performance. So there is no process, but you know, they believe in managing a performance, and if employees aren't managing the performance, they'll get asked why they're not, because that's important. But doing it without a process. I don't know. I do have to add, however, there is a very natural and important aspect of performance management which does involve bureaucracy, and I'm thinking particularly around things like calibration. Because of bias. You know, bias is negative. We don't want, we want to reduce the impact of bias as much as we can, and therefore we want to calibrate how different managers are assessing people's performance. But calibration is always a bit of a clunk. It's always going to be clunky. It's a piece of bureaucracy. It's not a natural thing to happen in an organisation. But it's important. You know, either we accept calibration or we accept bias, and I think probably calibration is the lesser of the two evils, unless we do something much more radical like change the whole organization to have, you know, agile autonomous teams, you know, where people don't have to assess each other's performance so much, but you know, that I don't think that applies everywhere. More positive use of positive psychology, so more focus on paying attention to employees, on recognising employees rather than giving them negative feedback, or doing what SEERs do about encouraging people to ask for feedback rather than encouraging them to give feedback, because that reduces the sort of resistance which is often set up. Otti, again, you do some really interesting posts. Fairly recently you were mentioning Benjamin Zander, who I love because does these amazing things with orchestras and getting people to learn music around the world. But one of the things he talks about and writes in his book is this idea that he gives his students at the beginning of the year an A for their assessment for the end of the year, and all they've got to do is write a letter explaining what they'll do that deserves getting that A, because then that sort of embeds that positive expectation in themselves that they're going to perform really well. So from a performance differentiation perspective, it's hopeless, but in terms of boosting the performance of everybody in the class, it's tremendous, and that's basically what WD-40 do for their performance management. Some improved focus on intrinsic motivation. I'd suggest not enough. You know, there's still a lot of alignment between reviews and individual bonuses, but I think we're getting slightly smarter at understanding some of the negative consequences of that. And more sort of behavioural approaches, so use of design thinking, getting employees involved in redesigning performance management, use of nudging, those sort of things. More social, horizontal rather than simply vertical objectives. Objectives about how you connect to the people around you. Microsoft, they review people on 3 main objectives, and I think they still do this. Your own individual performance, but secondly, how you've helped other people perform, and thirdly, how you've helped other people help you. Oh, love it. Beautiful. Team-based feedback. I just can't see what the problem is here. Again, we did this at EY in the 1990s. We got teams together in a room, put up flip charts with their names at the top, gave people post-it notes, asked them to write a couple of positives, a couple of negatives for each person around the room, put the post-it notes on the flip chart. Person took their flip chart and grouped the post-it notes and made sense of the feedback. Everyone shared their feedback with the team as a whole. It's a brilliant way of doing team performance management. Menlo Innovations, I love this. Their suggestion is they get individuals to invite their whole teams to go to lunch, and it's about the individual. The individual talks about what they're trying to do and how they're growing and where their focus is, and then the whole team sort of talks about that individual and makes suggestions for how they can improve. Brilliant. And lots of suggestions. This is a really common one. Lots of organisations encouraging networks across the organisation to give feedback to each other, to recognise each other, even to sort of pay each other sometimes. I'm running out of time, but let me just give you one more idea, because I do love this one, and it's not a popular idea. But I love mentioning it because I want more organisations, actually a organisation. I don't know any organisation that does this, but Samuel Colbert wrote a book on performance previews. He called them quite early on in that sort of transformation curve. And he's got this idea that it should be the manager and the employee together as a dyad who are reviewed, because if an employee isn't performing well, whose fault is that? Is it the employee? Is it the manager? So why don't you get that dyad together and review their performance as a dyad? It makes so much sense to me, but nobody's doing it. You could be the first one. You could be the case study of that approach. I think it would be great. Where did we get to? Use of language. Microsoft talking about perspectives and connects rather than feedback and reviews. It's a small thing, but it can make a big difference. And technology and data, not always positive, but often it is. Lots of organisations using beautiful little apps to do different things. Set objectives, get feedback, get coaching, be reviewed, have a career conversation, and so on. So not a big ERP type system, but point applications, and using data to reduce bias in the system. Great, wonderful. More of it, please. So lots of different things going on, and the key for me is no organisation can do everything that I've been talking about, and in a sense you shouldn't even be trying. That's not the point. What we need to be doing is to ensure that you pick what's important to you. And so one of my recommendations is this idea that you set performance management principles, that you articulate how you want performance management to work. They may cascade down from Otti's political ideologies. They may be based upon key paradoxes in your organisation. How do you use technology and be human at the same time, or focus on individuals and teams, or have the manager and the employee taking responsibility. We want to do both of those. How do you do it? The answer to that question can often inform sort of useful principles to articulate what performance management will look like for you. So Adobe, General Electric, Bridgewater, I know Antoinette talks a lot about as well. A great example for that alignment and cascade from principles to practice. Bridgewater have got over 200 principles, far too many. But their key ones are about robust transparency, radical transparency, radical candor. And because those are those principles and they align their practices around those principles, performance management is this really transparent, candor-based process where basically any meeting you attend, you're expected to use a device and an app to give feedback to all the other people in that meeting all the time. I'd hate it. No. But that doesn't matter because I don't want to be employed by them. They don't want to employ me. They find the people who would value that proposition, and they look after those. We need more of that. We need to get away from this sort of bland, best practice land where everyone does the same thing. It's that organisations are focusing on different things. Ideally, obviously, in this group, we'd like to see more principles about empowering and enabling and liberating. But there's room for those organisations. To me, Otti, you'll disagree, but for me, there's room for those organisations that want to command and control their people too. So set principles. Principles are really important to talk about how you want performance management to run. What's even more important than principles is objectives. What do you want your performance management to do? And there's a related idea in the performance management area about debundling, that rather than performance management focused on all these objectives, Herman Aquinas has identified 22 different objectives that performance management tries to meet. Rather than doing all of those, let's pare it back and focusing on something much more specific. The two main opportunities tend to be either development or reward, because it's difficult to do both. Nobody's going to be open about their skill gaps when they're worried about it impacting their pay. So it's useful to separate those two. But you can separate, you can focus, you can debundle on any of those 22 objectives. This book, really good book from Alan Colquitt, you may have also seen at the HR Congress and other places. He focuses on strategic execution. If you read Mark Efron's writing about performance management, I think he focuses on strategic execution as well. Great, fine. Yeah, it's a really valid, important objective. But I think it's a different type of performance management than one that focuses on development or even differentiated reward. Tamara Chandler, who I think is also involved in this book. So, hi Tamara, if you're on the call. Has got a model, a sort of 3-dimensional model where she talks about, how you can sort of prioritize perhaps these 3 objectives to different extents. I think that's really interesting, much better than what most organisations do today. I still think really you need to choose. Yeah, if you can choose one, that's when... in the academy, I do process design training as well. And I always say in that course, design a good process, pick one objective, not 22, one, and go to town on making that process work against that objective. By the way, I think debundling is a great idea, but really, rather than take a process and try to work out what its objective is, let's start with an objective and work out what the process is. That's sort of the way that we should be doing it, really. And obviously, this group, you are here to understand how to make businesses and therefore people flourish better. So wouldn't it be wonderful if we could set flourishing as our objective? And this isn't common. Otti, when we talked about this before, I think you were a little bit surprised by that when I said that. Because we want performance management to be motivating, but generally we're trying to do something in a motivating way. We're trying to help people develop in a motivating way or differentiate their reward in a motivating way. Motivation is the supplementary benefit, it's not the main one. And maybe it should be the main one. And I don't think there are many organisations that do focus on that one thing. This is one example, Harvey Nash. Performance management to them is performance motivation. Wonderful idea. A couple of years ago, I had a go rethinking SMART objectives if you were focusing on motivating your people rather than measuring them. And I came up with this acronym of musical goals. Goals, objectives, which are deliberately designed to motivate the individual. They still need to be focused on the business as well, which is the bit about coherence, but primarily about the individual. So there are things we can do. I just don't think we've done them yet. So there are so many areas that we could take this project, but my suggestion, for what it's worth, would be let's focus on fostering flourishing. I think that's what we should be doing. It's important, all of the work that Otti and Antoinette are leading around good organisations, flourishing and ethics and so on. Brilliant, love it all. Performance management's important as well. So there's just a wonderful confluence between those two things. It's used less extensively. If we try to develop a manifesto for performance management to differentiate reward, I think there's less that we could do because there's lots of organisations and lots of ideas already about how to do that. There's less out there about focusing performance management on flourishing. And I do think it's much more feasible to develop a manifesto on one thing, on one aspect of performance management, like flourishing. I think we'd really struggle to do it for, performance management as a whole, because a manifesto for organisations that believe performance management's about development would be a very different manifesto for one that believe that performance management's about reward or whatever it may be. I'd love us to connect performance management to flourishing, or to develop a fostering flourishing process, and see where that goes. But for those of you on the call or listening to this video at a later different point, thank you for spending this time with me. I hope some of it's been useful. Much more in the academy, of course, or occasionally on LinkedIn. Yes, for those of you on the call, enjoy the rest of this session, and look forward to seeing you in the LinkedIn group, and to working with you on doing something really useful for organisations. Thank you, and all the best.